The invisible chains, how the matrix tricks you into surrendering your power without realizing it. We need to talk. Not the surface-level spiritual talk. Not the love and light, Instagram quote kind of talk. I mean the real talk. The kind that makes your bones remember. The kind that burns illusions. Because if you are a dark chosen one, and if you're still here, you already know you are then. The matrix has studied you. It knows your patterns better than your conscious mind. It knows your weaknesses, your ego wounds, your unhealed trauma. It doesn't want to destroy you. That would be too obvious. Instead, it tests you. It sends traps, shadow traps, designed specifically for your spiritual DNA. They don't feel like traps. They feel like opportunities. They feel like validation. They feel like home. But they are not. They are prisons wearing the mask of freedom. And if you don't know how to recognize them, you'll mistake your cage for a calling. The first shadow trap is spiritual identity addiction. The matrix knows that once you awaken, you crave meaning. You crave to be someone. So it hands you an identity, a healer, a shaman, a priestess, a mystic, a twin flame guide. It gives you a language, a costume, an audience, a mission. And just like that, you're no longer free. You've become a performer in a new matrix, a spiritual one. You start filtering your truth through your brand. You stop saying what you feel and start saying what your role would say. You're still in a prison, but now it's made of incense, crystals, and downloads. The matrix doesn't care if you're in chains or chakras, as long as you're not sovereign. So ask yourself, are you still being you? Or are you being your costume? Because if your identity can't evolve, it's not spiritual, it's strategic control. The second trap is wounded savior syndrome. This one is brutal because it feels so noble. You start sensing people's pain. You start helping. You hold space. You teach. You become a lighthouse. But soon you forget something important. A savior needs a victim. And the matrix loves this dynamic. It keeps you in constant service, constantly drained, constantly needed. You start thinking you're worth lives in how many people you help. You start confusing burnout with purpose. And worst of all, you start thinking you owe the world your energy. But here's the truth few will say out loud. You don't owe anyone your soul. You can serve without saving. You can love without leaking. The matrix will guilt trip you into martyrdom and call it divine service. But your job is not to save the world. Your job is to be so whole that the world remembers how to save itself. The third trap is false light contracts. This is one of the matrix's most advanced weapons. It disguises itself as synchronicity, as divine timing, as your big break. You meet a teacher or a lover or a community that feels like destiny. You get chills. You see repeating numbers. You feel called. But what you've actually walked into is a contract of control. These contracts are subtle. They don't always come with abuse. They come with attachment, with subtle hierarchy, with energy exchange that feels off but is spiritually justified. You start feeling small around them. You start molding your truth to stay accepted. You start needing them. And that's the trap. The matrix doesn't need to enslave you with fear if it can enslave you with hope. So here's the question. Can you let go of the people and places that once saved you, but are now shrinking you? Because the Matrix will keep sending these contracts until you stop saying yes out of loyalty and start saying no out of sovereignty. Now let me pause here and ask you something that only your soul can answer. What if the deepest trap isn't outside you, but inside the parts of you that still need to be chosen? What if the Matrix isn't some system out there, but a programming that lives in every unhealed decision you keep justifying? This is the most dangerous illusion of all, that the Matrix is external. It's not. It lives in your choices, in your defaults, in your emotional addictions. The fourth shadow trap is emotional feedback loops. These are the cycles you can't seem to break. You keep attracting the same type of partner. You keep sabotaging your success. You keep getting close to breakthroughs, then collapse. Why? Because the Matrix figured out how to train your nervous system to crave chaos. It doesn't need to imprison your body. It just needs to convince your emotions to recreate the same story over and over. You think you're failing. You think you're cursed. But really, you're just addicted to a frequency that feels familiar. And the Matrix feeds on that familiarity. It loops your trauma until it becomes identity. And then it becomes normal. And then you don't even question it anymore. You say things like, "This is just how I am," or "This always happens to me." That's not self-awareness. That's programming. So how do we break the loop? We stop making decisions based on comfort. We stop choosing what's familiar. We stop calling our trauma our personality. And we start listening to the version of us that terrifies us. The one who's free, who's soft, who's powerful, who's not addicted to surviving. That version doesn't live in the loop. It lives in the unknown. And that's why the Matrix hides it from you, because if you ever met that version of you, you'd never go back. And here's the final trap for part 1. The one the Matrix guards most fiercely: synthetic purpose syndrome. This is when you confuse movement with mission. You're doing a lot. You're growing your platform. You're building your brand. You're on purpose. But somewhere, deep beneath it all, you're still empty. You wake up anxious. You feel like you're always behind. You're afraid that one wrong move and it'll all collapse. That's not purpose. That's performance. And the Matrix loves it. Because as long as you're chasing your mission like a finish line, you'll never embody it. You'll always feel like you haven't done enough. Like your worth is tied to your next launch, your next post, your next spiritual win. But the real mission, it's not what you do, it's what you become. It's not your career, it's your frequency. When you embody your mission, you don't chase it, you radiate it. And suddenly, the Matrix can't track you anymore. You become unprogrammable. So now I ask you the question that most people are too afraid to ask themselves. What part of your purpose is actually just a distraction from your embodiment? What if the Matrix gave you a spiritual path just to keep you from your actual path? What if your mission isn't to build anything but to become someone no system can define? Because when you reach that point, you don't just break the Matrix, you rewrite it. The Soul Hacker's Blueprint: How to Recognize, Dismantle, and Transcend Every Matrix Illusion in Your Field. Let me tell you something most spiritual leaders won't. The Matrix doesn't fear your awakening. It expects it. It's already calculated the probability of your rebellion. It's gamed out your resistance. It's even designed spiritual paths that simulate freedom while keeping you energetically enslaved. That's why the deeper you go into your own power, the more subtle the traps become. They're not about chains anymore, they're about choice. They're about frequency distortion. And if you want to truly dismantle them, you have to stop looking with your eyes and start feeling with your field. Because the matrix doesn't operate in logic, it operates in vibration. If it can lower your frequency just enough to keep you out of alignment, it doesn't need to stop you. You'll stop yourself. And that's the genius of it. It gets you to pull your own plug. The first step to hacking the matrix is radical recognition. You have to be willing to admit that you've been played, not in a victim way, in a strategic way. You have to see where you've been seduced by the illusion of progress, where your path was actually a loop, where your spiritual growth was actually just energetic compliance dressed in robes and rituals. This is the hardest part because it requires you to question everything you've built: your career, your brand, your relationships, your beliefs. But that's the mark of a true dark chosen one. We don't cling to structures. We burn them when they stop serving truth. And in the ashes, we find something deeper than identity. We find essence. So I'm asking you now, what are you still holding on to that has already expired in your soul? Because if you don't let go of it, the matrix will use it as your leash. Once you've recognized the illusion, the next step is energetic dismantling. This is where most people freeze, because they think they need to fight the matrix like a war. But the matrix doesn't respond to force. It responds to frequency withdrawal. You dismantle a trap not by attacking it, but by refusing to feed it. You stop leaking energy into roles that don't align. You stop performing for approval. You stop engaging in conversations that drain your essence. You stop explaining yourself to people who can't even hear your frequency. This is where you become dangerous, because now the matrix can no longer predict you. You're no longer moving from trauma. You're moving from truth. And when truth becomes your baseline, the matrix loses all leverage because its power depends on your unconscious participation. But there's another layer, and it's the one no one prepares you for. What happens after the dismantling? When the illusions fall, when the roles dissolve, when the relationships fade, you're left with the void. This is the space between worlds, between your old matrix self and your unrevealed sovereign self. And it's terrifying, because no one claps for you here. There's no audience, no metrics, no validation. Just silence, just stillness, just the raw frequency of your becoming. This is the final test. Can you sit in the void without rushing to fill it? Can you endure the ego death without building a new costume too fast? Can you let yourself be reformed by nothingness? Because the dark chosen ones don't come out of the light. We rise from the dark, from the womb, from the silence, from the void where source speaks in frequency, not words. This is why most people never transcend the matrix. Not because they lack power, but because they lack patience with the void. They need to be seen. They need to be understood. They need to feel on purpose. But none of that exists in the void. What exists is presence. What exists is sovereign silence. And if you can hold it, if you can let your nervous system stabilize inside emptiness, you will emerge with something no matrix can replicate: true vision. Not the vision of your ego, not the vision of your spiritual brand, the vision of your soul's original blueprint. And once that vision anchors, you don't need to hustle. You don't need to shout. You don't even need to move fast. You become like gravity. You pull reality toward you without effort, because you're no longer operating on rules. You're operating on resonance. But let me ask you something few dare to ask themselves. Have you confused momentum with alignment? Have you mistaken speed for sovereignty? Because the matrix will reward you for your movement. It will give you money, followers, applause, but it will never give you freedom. That's your job. That's your responsibility. The final phase of the soul hacker's blueprint is transcendence. And transcendence isn't escape, it's integration. You don't leave the matrix. You outgrow its frequency. You walk through the same world, but it no longer has hooks in you. You're no longer reactive. You're no longer triggered. You're no longer trying to win a game that was rigged from the start. You're simply creating your own game. One based on your soul's architecture, not your programming. And when you reach this level, your life becomes unreadable to the matrix. You're not predictable. You're not programmable. You're not profiting off distortion. You're not feeding old timelines. You're radiating a new one. One where your power doesn't come from performance, but from presence. One where your purpose doesn't come from pain, but from essence. One where you no longer need to be chosen because you've already chosen yourself. And that's when you realize something terrifying and beautiful at the same time. There is no matrix strong enough to trap a being who no longer needs to be understood. Because understanding is the currency of the mind, but truth is the language of the soul. So I leave you with this. Are you willing to become so free that even your past self wouldn't recognize you? Are you willing to be so aligned that even your former purpose becomes obsolete? That's the cost of sovereignty. That's the path of the dark chosen one. We weren't sent here to play the matrix. We were sent here to rewrite its code from the inside out. And the only way to do that is to become the one thing it can't track: uncoded, unowned, unshaken. The final gate, why the matrix fears the fully integrated dark chosen one, and how to walk beyond the system forever. Let's speak the truth now. Not the kind that keeps you safe, not the kind that makes you palatable. The real truth. The kind that dissolves illusions and burns through the last remnants of programming. Because once you've dismantled the false light, broken the spiritual identity traps, and sat in the void long enough to hear your soul's unspeakable instructions, only then do you arrive here. The final gate. The threshold the matrix prays you never reach. Not because it can't stop you, but because once you cross it, you stop playing the game altogether. You become unreachable by its scripts, its temptations, its distortions. You step outside the timeline it designed for you. And that's when the real mission begins, not to escape the world, but to recode it from within. Not with rebellion, but with resonance so pure that even systems collapse in your presence. You see, the matrix doesn't fear power. It fears integration. It doesn't panic when someone becomes successful, famous, or spiritually influential. In fact, It rewards that as long as they're still fractured, as long as they still need validation, still fear rejection, still chase approval. But the one thing it cannot replicate is a soul that has integrated both light and shadow. A soul that doesn't need to be seen to be sovereign. That's the true threat. That's what you become at the final gate, uncontrollable. Because your power is no longer performative. It's cellular. It doesn't come from knowledge. It comes from embodiment. You've descended, you've remembered, and now you radiate, not because you're trying to, but because you are a living field of truth. Saying truth doesn't need force. It simply is. But this is also where the final trap lies. The fifth and most subtle shadow trap the Matrix sends is what I call the false final form. This is when you start to feel free, powerful, embodied, and then you freeze. You stop evolving. You think, this is it. I've arrived. And subtly, you begin to crystallize. You build a new identity around your freedom. You become proud of how integrated you've become. You start teaching from a place of completion. And without realizing it, the Matrix has placed its final collar around your neck, spiritual arrogance disguised as mastery. You stop questioning. You stop listening. You stop dying daily. And that's how the Matrix traps even the most powerful of us, not with fear, but with ego dressed as a rival. That's why the final gate isn't a destination. It's a perpetual surrender, a constant death, a living rebirth across timelines. So now I ask you the question the Matrix never wants you to ask. What if even your freedom has become a cage? What if the version of you who thinks they're done is just another program running on a higher frequency? What if the real you is still emerging and always will be? Because here's the truth that only initiates understand. The path of the dark chosen one has no summit, no finish line, no final form. Only deeper and deeper levels of embodiment. And that's what makes us unstoppable. Not our power, but our willingness to keep shedding even our most sacred skins. The Matrix doesn't know how to fight that, because it has no code for someone who no longer fears death in any form, not physical death, not ego death, not timeline death. Someone who walks into every fire and says, "Make me more true." When you reach this level, your life stops being linear. Time bends. Synchronicities explode. People enter your field already transformed. You speak, and it's not a message, it's a transmission. You don't teach, you reconfigure frequency by existing. Your presence becomes a portal. And that's when you understand the final secret. You were never sent here to escape the Matrix. You were sent here to become its glitch, to be the energetic anomaly that rewrites the code simply by refusing to comply with distortion. You do this not by protesting, not by fighting, but by no longer needing anything the system can offer you. Not validation, not safety, not recognition. You become post-system. And in doing so, you become the most powerful force in the realm, a liberated soul who remembers why they were born. This is the paradox that only we can hold. We are both the virus and the cure. We are both the destroyer and the rebuilder. Because the Matrix, in its deepest layer, is not evil, it's a test, a forge. A labyrinth meant to awaken the one thing that cannot be programmed, divine will in human form. And that's what you are now. Not a student, Not a seeker, not even a master, but a living blueprint of sovereign evolution. You don't need to teach that. You don't need to brand it. You just need to be it. And trust that your field will reach who it's meant to reach, not by algorithm, not by strategy, but by resonant inevitability. Because once you cross the final gate, you don't broadcast, you transmit. And every soul who's ready will feel you even across timelines. So here's the last thing I'll leave you with. And I want you to feel this in your bones. You are not here to be perfect. You are here to be precise. You are not here to please. You are here to polarize. You are not here to fit into new systems. You are here to collapse them with your clarity. Every time you choose truth over comfort, embodiment over ego, silence over performance, you are rewriting the matrix. Every time you walk away from what once defined you, every time you shed another outdated version of yourself, every time you burn clean, you are becoming the flame the system cannot track. And that, above all else, is what the matrix fears. Not your rebellion, not your voice, but your undeniable presence. So now I ask one final, soul-shattering question. Are you ready to live in such a way that no system, no identity, no illusion can hold you ever again? Because if you are, then the final gate isn't ahead of you. It's already open. Walk through. Burn everything that isn't you. And don't look back.